Wyoming Territory.
Autumn, 1889. The wind carried dust and whispers across the prairie, the kind that clung to your bones and never let go. And on that wind came a woman named Maggie Doyle, round of figure, soft of hand, with eyes that had learned to expect little and give everything. She stepped down from the wagon outside Bellamy Ranch, her boots sinking into the cold mud, her breath fogging the air. The house stood there, long, wooden, lonely, its windows dark as if they hadn't seen laughter in a long while. No one came out to greet her. Only the wind answered, pushing through the porch boards with a hollow groan. Then she heard it, a sound that pierced the silence like sunlight through a storm. A baby crying. Maggie lifted her skirts and walked up the steps, her heart thudding like hooves on hard ground. No one had told her much, only that a widower needed someone to tend his infant son and keep the house from falling apart. That was enough. She knocked once, twice. No answer. So she opened the door. The warmth hit her like memory. She stepped inside, and there he was, tiny, red-faced, fists waving in protest at a world too big for him. Maggie bent down, her breath trembling, and without thinking she began to hum, an old Gaelic lullaby her mother used to sing when the nights were long and hunger made the walls echo. The baby stopped crying. For a moment, all the noise in the world disappeared. That's when she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the hallway. He stood there, James Bellamy, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man the land itself seemed to shape. His face looked carved out of grief and hard winters. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his hands still dusted with earth. His eyes met hers, and he didn't smile. Didn't even nod, just looked at her, like a man unsure if she was real or just another burden brought by fate. James, you the woman they sent. Maggie A., sir. Margaret Doyle. The agency said you needed someone for the boy. James, you can cook? So keep to yourself? Maggie, I can do all that, sir, though I was told the baby needs more than a cook. James stared at her for a long time, eyes flicking down, taking in her shape, not with desire, but with the blunt honesty of a man who measured everything by its usefulness. She saw the doubt there. Plain as day, Maggie. No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby. Something shifted then. A silence so deep even the fire seemed to wait. James's jaw tightened, his eyes flickered. Maybe shame, maybe understanding. He said only 2 words. James, then stay. That night, the wind turned colder, and the stars came out like scattered silver. Maggie sat by the cradle, rocking the child with one hand, mending a torn blanket with the other. The baby's little breaths filled the room, steady and warm. In that quiet, she whispered to the child, not knowing the man down the hall could hear her. Maggie, hush now, little one. Your mama's gone where the rivers don't freeze, but I'll keep you warm till spring finds us both. He stood there a long while listening, and though he said nothing, for the first time in months, he didn't feel alone in his own house. Out there on the edge of the world, where grief and frost share the same silence, a woman arrived not to be wanted, but to be needed, and sometimes that's all love ever asks for. Days turned into weeks at Bellamy Ranch, and the house stayed quiet as a church on Monday morning. Maggie rose before dawn, lit the stove, and carried her chores like prayer beads, one by one, careful, steady, never rushed. The man of the house spoke little. When he needed something, he wrote it on a folded slip of paper and left it by the sugar tin. More salt. Shoes need mending. Baby's milk running low. She answered him the same way. Done. Handled. Or sometimes, nothing at all. The silence between them wasn't cruel. It was tired. Like a man and a woman both too used to being alone to remember what it meant to speak. The ranch hands came and went, their laughter echoing across the fields, never quite reaching the porch. They whispered when she passed, about her wide hips, her heavy walk, the way she filled a doorway like she'd been carved to fit it. One of them, a thin boy with a cruel grin, said loud enough for her to hear, "Boss sure got himself a big meal this time." Maggie didn't flinch. She kept walking, carrying a pail of milk that sloshed over her knuckles. Her silence was her shield, and her dignity her weapon. She wasn't ashamed. She was simply alive, and she had work to do. Inside that lonely house, the baby grew quiet under her care. He began to smile, to kick, to recognize the sound of her footsteps. And though James Bellamy never said thank you, he noticed. The shirts she washed were folded square and dry. The meals were hot, the room warm, and the cries that once broke his sleep now faded to peace. Some nights, he'd stand in the hallway and watch her through the crack of a half-closed door. The way she rocked the baby, slow and sure, her hair slipping loose from its braid. He wanted to speak, but words had become strangers to him, so he said nothing, just stood there till her soft humming lulled the house to sleep. Maggie didn't need his thanks. She found purpose in the rhythm: wash, mend, soothe, repeat. But sometimes, when the wind howled and the walls sighed, she'd wonder what it might sound like if he spoke her name. Just once, softly, winter crawled closer. The air turned sharp, and frost crept across the windows like lace. Maggie sewed blankets from old coats, her hands raw but steady. At night, she'd pour herself tea, sit by the stove, and look at the folded notes he left her. They weren't love letters, just lists, reminders, needs. But in that cold, lonely world, they were proof she belonged somewhere. One morning she found a note she hadn't expected. No request, no order, just 2 words, written in a rough, unfamiliar hand. Thank you. She stared at it for a long while, her throat tight. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it between the pages of her Bible. Because in that house of silence, 2 words were enough. And when she stepped out onto the porch that evening, the wind had gone still. The stars had come out early, hanging over the land like candles in a dark church. She looked toward the barn, where James worked late under the dim lantern light, and whispered to herself, "Maybe some hearts speak best when they're quiet." The days stretched long at Bellamy Ranch, golden in the light, gray in the quiet. Maggie kept to her rhythm like a clock that refused to stop ticking, even when no one was listening. Each morning, she baked before sunrise. Not because anyone asked her to, but because the scent of bread made the house feel less like a tomb. The baby was crawling now, his laughter small but brave against the silence. And every time he smiled, she whispered, "That's it, little one. Fill this place with sound." James Bellamy worked from dawn to dark. He'd ride out before she woke, return when the lamps were lit, and eat alone at the edge of the table. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes not even that. But she noticed. The plates came back clean, the coffee pot empty, the smallest crumbs of her cornbread gone. A quiet kind of conversation began between them, not in words, in proof. One evening, after the chores were done, Maggie stood in the kitchen staring at the old flour tin. There was just enough left for one more loaf. She thought of the man who hadn't smiled since she arrived, the man who had lost more than he'd ever said. And she thought, maybe bread could do what words could not. So she kneaded carefully, her strong hands softening the dough like prayer. When it rose golden in the pan, she added a handful of blueberries, crushed them in with her thumb, and let the scent drift through the house. It smelled like warmth, like forgiveness. When it cooled, she sliced a piece and wrapped it in cloth. Then she set it on his door with a small note written in her neat, careful hand. "It's blueberry." The baby liked the smell. She didn't wait to see if he'd take it. Just went back to her room, heart quiet but curious. The next morning, the cloth was gone. The plate sat empty, and though there was no reply, no thank you note, no spoken word, she knew. Because that night, when she brought the baby's blanket to the line, she saw it. On the porch rail, a single wildflower, pale and crooked, stuck inside an old horseshoe nail. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maggie smiled to herself and whispered, "Well, look at that. The man can talk after all." From that day forward, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer heavy. It carried something gentler, a quiet understanding, a respect that didn't need a voice. She could feel it in the air when he walked past her, in the pause before he spoke, in the way he left the door unlatched now when he went to the barn. And sometimes, at night, when the wind brushed the shutters, she'd think about that loaf of bread, how something so small could soften stone, how kindness, once given, never really stopped moving. It just found new hands to hold. That evening, she wrote in her Bible margin, "Respect begins where pride used to live." And somewhere outside, under the wide Wyoming sky, James Bellamy looked toward the light in her window, and for the first time thought about tomorrow. The rain came hard that week, drumming against the roof till the sound became part of their breathing. The fields turned to rivers, the horses restless, the sky the color of ash. Inside the ranch house, Maggie worked barefoot. Her old shoes had torn clean through, and every step left a print of mud across the kitchen floor. She didn't mind. The earth and her had always been close, James noticed. From the barn door, he watched her haul water from the well, dress clinging wet against her body, her braid heavy with rain. She was a sight he wasn't prepared for. Not soft, not small, but alive. Her face flushed, her breath steady, her laughter carried by thunder. She looked like the land itself, stubborn and beautiful, refusing to be broken. He turned away before she could see him watching. But that image stayed with him all night. The next morning, when she opened the front door, something waited on the porch. A pair of worn leather boots, polished clean, their soles stitched with care. A note sat on top, written in his rough, square handwriting. "These were my sisters. She never came back to get them. I think they'd rather stay here." Maggie stood there for a long moment, her throat tightening in a way she didn't understand. Then she smiled, small, quiet, the kind that never needed witnesses. She slipped her feet into the boots. They fit like memory, snug, warm, right. When she stepped outside, the mud didn't pull her down anymore. Her steps sounded firmer, lighter, like a woman who knew she was seen. That evening, as she carried supper to the table, James looked up from his plate. For the first time, he didn't look through her. He looked at her. "You found them," he said. She nodded. "Aye, they're good boots." He hesitated, eyes flicking to the floor. "She would have wanted them used." Maggie smiled softly. "Then I'll use them well." They ate in silence after that. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was warmer now, like the air after rain, when the land smells alive again. Later that night, Maggie sat by the fire, mending a torn sleeve, the boots resting by the hearth. She thought of the man upstairs, the grief in his eyes, the kindness in his awkwardness. She whispered to herself, "He's learning to give without fear." And James, in his room above, stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of her movements below. For the first time in months, he felt the house breathe again. The next morning, when she walked across the yard in those boots, the ranch hands turned to look. But their smirks died quick. Something in her step had changed. It wasn't pride. It was peace, and though no one said it aloud, every man there knew. Maggie Doyle wasn't just passing through. She was part of that land now. The wind had changed that night, colder, crueler. It crept through the cracks of Carter's Hollow like a warning. By dusk, the baby's cries had turned sharp, feverish. Maggie moved fast, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, hands steady as stone. She sliced ginger thin, poured boiling water over herbs she'd gathered by the creek. It wasn't science, it was memory, old remedies whispered from mother to daughter. The child burned hot against her arm. She murmured softly, words that weren't English but comfort all the same. She didn't pray, she worked. Then the door burst open. James stood there, wild-eyed, shirt half untucked, fear written across his face. He held the baby awkwardly, desperate. "He won't stop crying," he rasped. "He's burning up." Maggie stepped close, gentle as ever. "I know what to do," she said softly. "Ginger water and cool cloth. I've done this before." But when she reached for the child, James stepped back. Something hard flickered in his eyes. "I didn't hire you to be his mother," he snapped. The words hit like a bullet. The room went still. Only the fire crackled, low and judging. Maggie didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood there, hands still half raised, the damp cloth dripping down her wrist. Her voice came quiet. "I never asked to be anyone's wife." "Mr. Bellamy." Then she folded the cloth neatly and set it on the table. Walked out without another word. The door closed behind her with a sound that wasn't loud, but final. James stood there in the silence, the baby crying against his chest. He looked down at the cloth, the steam still rising, and suddenly every ounce of anger drained from him. He wasn't mad at her. He was afraid of how much he needed her. That night, he sat beside the crib, the boy finally dozing, fever still clinging. He rubbed his hands over his face, whispered something into the dark. "I didn't hire you to be his mother." "But you already are." Hours passed. Then, soft footsteps in the hall, a creak of the stove, the faint sound of water pouring. James stayed still. Minutes later, he found something by the door. A wooden basin filled with warm water and herbs. A folded towel, neatly wrung out, no note. No name! He picked it up, went back to the crib, and did as she had taught him. The baby's breath steadied. The fever broke before dawn. When the first light touched the floor, James looked toward the kitchen. The air smelled of ginger and forgiveness. He whispered into the quiet, "She doesn't want to be your mother, son. But she's better than I ever deserved." And for the first time since his wife died, James Bellamy bowed his head, not in grief, but in gratitude. Morning came with the smell of rain and ashes. Maggie was in the kitchen early, her sleeves rolled high, the rhythm of her hands steady, kneading bread like she was mending the world one fold at a time. James hadn't spoken since the night before, but his silence had changed. It wasn't made of anger now. It was something heavier, regret, maybe. While sweeping the hallway later that day, Maggie's broom struck against a loose board beneath the stairs. Curiosity led her to lift it, and beneath, she found an old wooden box, dust-covered, tied shut with a fading blue ribbon. She shouldn't have opened it, but sometimes life asks you to look at the things meant to stay hidden. Inside were letters, dozens of them, and a photograph. A young woman stared back, pale, fragile, beautiful in a way that didn't seem built to last. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, the name read, Clara Bellamy, James's late wife. The letters told their story, how she'd spent years trying to be smaller, quieter, thinner, how she'd starved herself piece by piece, believing love required her to vanish, and how James, lost in work and grief, had never told her she was enough. When Maggie heard footsteps behind her, she froze. James stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the box in her lap. He didn't shout. He just exhaled, long, tired, honest. "I thought I'd buried those with her," he said. His voice was low, almost broken. "I didn't mean to," Maggie began, but he stopped her. "No, you should know." He sat down beside her, his hands trembling slightly. "I watched her disappear right in front of me," he whispered. She stopped eating, stopped smiling, and I let her think she had to be loved. He rubbed his thumb over the photo, his eyes distant. "She died believing she wasn't enough." Maggie didn't speak. She didn't offer pity. He didn't need that. She just placed her hand gently on his. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him gave way. "You're the first person to touch me without asking permission," he said quietly, "and the first one who didn't flinch when I broke." Maggie's voice was steady. "I don't fix what's broken, Mr. Bellamy. I just don't run from it." For a moment, neither moved. The storm outside had passed, and only the soft crackle of the fire filled the space between them. James set the photograph down carefully, then looked at her again, not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as the woman who had carried life back into his hollow house. Something shifted that night. Not love, not yet, but the kind of quiet knowing that starts it. The kind that stays long after words run out. Autumn came softly that year, brushing gold across the hills and painting the cottonwoods by the river in shades of honey and rust. Maggie found herself humming more often as she worked, her voice filling the quiet corners of the house. The baby had learned to crawl, laughter following him like a small miracle, and for the first time since her arrival, the Bellamy Ranch no longer felt haunted. James spoke now. Not much, but enough. Sometimes it was just a thank you, other times a question about her cooking, or a story from before the war. And every evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky burned red, He'd linger a little longer by the kitchen door before heading out to the barn. Maggie noticed, but she never said a word. One chilly afternoon, she went up to the attic to find blankets for the baby's crib. The space smelled of cedar and dust, filled with boxes that hadn't been touched in years. When she opened one marked with faded initials, CB, she found a dress, cream-colored, laced at the sleeves. Soft as memory, delicate as promise. The tag was still pinned to the collar, yellowed by time. Maggie held it against herself for a moment and smiled sadly. She didn't belong to silk and lace. She belonged to warmth and earth and laughter. When James came in that evening, she tried to hide the dress behind her. But he saw it and stopped in the doorway. "I found it upstairs," she said softly. "I'll put it back." He shook his head. "No, don't." He walked closer, his boots slow on the wooden floor. "She never wore it," he said quietly. "Said she'd wait until she was smaller. Said the dress would look better when she lost more weight." Maggie looked down at the fabric in her hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's not hers anymore," James said. "It's the only thing in this house that's been waiting for the right person." She felt her throat tighten. "I'm not—" He stopped her before she could finish. "You are," he said. "You've been everything this place was missing." That night, Maggie stayed awake long after the lamps had burned low. She thought about the dress, about James's eyes when he said those words, and about the strange way her heart now seemed to know the sound of his footsteps before they reached the door. The next week, the town held its harvest festival, the first in years since the droughts and storms. Maggie went, carrying the baby on her hip, the cream dress flowing softly around her frame. Heads turned when she walked through the crowd, not out of mockery, but quiet awe. She didn't shrink beneath their eyes. She stood tall, proud, radiant. From a distance, James watched. He didn't move closer, didn't interrupt. He just watched, his hat in his hands, his heart somewhere between grief and grace. One of the ranch hands beside him muttered, "That the new nurse?" James smiled faintly. "No," he said. "That's the woman who kept my son alive. The woman who reminded me what home feels like." And for the first time in years, James Bellamy smiled without sorrow. The music from the festival carried over the hills that night, drifting through the open windows of the ranch house. Laughter, fiddle strings, the sound of a life beginning again. And under the soft glow of lanterns, Maggie swayed gently with the baby in her arms, the cream dress catching the firelight like it had been waiting all its life just for her. Winter crept down from the mountains early that year. The mornings came dressed in frost, and the fences along the Bellamy Ranch shimmered like glass when the first light touched them. Maggie stood on the porch one cold dawn, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching her breath curl into the air like ghosts of every word she never said. The ranch was different now. The walls held laughter instead of silence. The baby had grown stronger, chubby hands reaching for everything, his giggle echoing through the rooms like music. And James, he'd changed too. He spoke softer, looked longer, and when his eyes met hers, something unspoken always lingered there, something that felt like a promise. But Maggie had made up her mind.
She'd done what she came to do, heal a house that had forgotten warmth.
And now, she told herself, it was time to leave. That morning, she packed her things quietly. A few dresses, a book of recipes, a tiny pair of baby shoes the boy had outgrown. She placed her hand on the crib one last time, whispering a prayer of thanks. For the child, for the work, for the love she'd never dared to name. When James came in from the stables, she was standing by the door, bonnet in hand. He froze, his breath clouding in the cold air between them. "Where are you going?" he asked. She smiled, though it trembled. "My work's done here, Mr. Bellamy. The boy's strong now. He doesn't need me anymore." His jaw tightened. "And what about me?" Her heart ached, but she steadied herself. "You've got the ranch. You've got a son who looks at you like you hung the stars." "That's enough." He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. "Is it enough for you?" She hesitated, just long enough for the truth to spill through the cracks in her voice. "No, but wanting something doesn't mean it's yours to keep." James looked down for a moment, then back at her. "If I proposed right now," he said quietly, "would you think it's out of pity?" She met his gaze, steady, calm, but full of tears she refused to let fall. "No," she whispered. "But if you don't, I'll think you're afraid I mean it." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was alive, trembling with all the words they'd left unspoken for months. Then he reached out and took her hand. Rough, warm, certain. "Maggie Doyle," he said, voice low and sure. "You're the only woman I've ever wanted to walk home with." Her breath caught, a small, broken laugh slipping through. "And where exactly is home, Mr. Bellamy?" He smiled. "Right here, wherever you stand." The next morning, the frost was thicker, white across every roof and rail. When Maggie came down to the kitchen, she found a single gold ring lying beside her coffee cup. No note, no speech. Just a quiet gesture from a man who'd finally learned that love doesn't need many words. She slipped it onto her finger, tears falling before she could stop them. When James entered, she didn't turn right away. She just said softly, "Yes, but you'll wash the dishes after." And for the first time, laughter filled the Bellamy house. Real, deep, alive. A man's chuckle, a woman's warmth, a baby's giggle joining them like sunlight spilling over snow. Outside, the wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the sound of a new beginning. The ranch no longer felt haunted. It felt like home, and in that quiet Wyoming morning, love, gentle, imperfect, and finally free, decided to stay. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with grand gestures or promises under the stars. Sometimes it walks through a broken door, wearing muddy boots and carrying a crying child. It doesn't ask to be noticed. It just stays long enough to be trusted. Maggie Doyle never set out to find love on that lonely stretch of land. But she mended a house made of sorrow, and in return found a heart brave enough to meet her halfway. Because in the end, it was never about beauty or size or the years they lost to silence. It was about two souls who learned that love, real love, is quiet work. It feeds, it forgives. And when the frost comes, it doesn't run. It stays. If this story found its way to your heart tonight, don't forget to subscribe Old Wild West Tales, where every week another soul, another storm, and another kind of love finds its voice under the western sky. Until next time, keep your lanterns lit and your hearts open.